Okay, so you want to understand what it actually took to escape Chernobyl. Somewhere in that picture, the whole thing seems manageable. Here is the problem. The evacuation of Chernobyl was not one event. It was a cascading sequence of decisions made under incomplete information by people operating inside a system that was structurally incapable of telling the truth about what had just happened. And the gap between the official version of that evacuation and what the physics of the situation actually required is where the real story lives. Before we talk about who escaped and how, we must first establish a clear definition of what we are assessing. Because escaping Chernobyl was not one thing. It was at least four completely different problems happening simultaneously, each with a different timeline, a different set of actors, and a different threshold for what survival even meant. The first problem was immediate physical evacuation from the town of Pripyat, a planned Soviet city of approximately 49,360 residents, located 3 kilometers from the reactor. The second problem was the broader exclusion zone evacuation, covering 188 villages and towns within a 30-kilometer radius. The third problem was radiological contamination management, meaning controlling where the invisible material went after it left the reactor. The fourth problem was information suppression, which was not a side effect of the crisis. It was an active structural feature of how the Soviet government responded. Each of these problems operated on a different clock. Understanding the escape from Chernobyl means understanding all four simultaneously. Here is what the physics required versus what actually happened. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded on April 26, 1986, at 1:23 in the morning local time. Within the first hour, radiation levels at the reactor site were measured at 15,000 Röntgen per hour in certain locations. The lethal dose for a human being is 400 Röntgen absorbed over a short period. The firefighters who arrived first on scene without adequate dosimetry equipment absorbed doses that produced acute radiation syndrome within hours. The town of Pripyat, sitting 3 kilometers away, received no official evacuation order for 36 hours after the explosion. 36 hours during which children played outside, residents hung laundry, and a wedding was held in the city center. The invisible contamination was already settling across the town, while the official position remained that the situation was under control. The decision-making structure that produced that 36-hour delay is worth examining precisely because it explains the mechanics of how information moved, or failed to move, inside the Soviet bureaucratic system. Plant director Viktor Bryukhanov sent an initial report to Moscow, characterizing radiation levels at 3.6 Röntgen per hour. That number was not accurate. It was the maximum reading the available dosimeters could display. The actual levels exceeded that instrument ceiling by orders of magnitude. Bryukhanov either did not know this, or chose not to escalate it. The report went up the chain, carrying a number that made the situation appear containable. Moscow received a false picture. Local authorities received instructions calibrated to a false picture. The evacuation clock did not start running at 1:23 in the morning. It started running after the lie degraded far enough that the physical reality could no longer be managed around it. When the Pripyat evacuation finally began on April 27th at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it was executed with a speed that obscured how underprepared the system actually was. Residents were told to gather essentials for 2 or 3 days. They were told they would return. The official line was that this was a temporary precautionary measure. The buses that arrived numbered approximately 1,200 vehicles, drawn from Kiev and surrounding regions. Moving 49,360 people in a single coordinated column required roughly 3.5 hours of active loading and departure. On paper, that looks like an organized response. The actual contamination footprint those buses and their passengers carried out of the zone as they departed is a different calculation entirely. Each vehicle that entered Pripyat to collect evacuees moved through an active deposition area. Vehicles themselves became secondary contamination vectors as they returned south toward Kiev. The 30-kilometer exclusion zone evacuation that followed over the next several weeks was a larger and more complicated operation. By early May 1986, Soviet authorities had expanded the mandatory evacuation perimeter. The total number of people ultimately relocated from the exclusion zone in the immediate aftermath reached approximately 116,000 individuals across 188 settlements. Each village presented its own logistical problem. Collective farm workers in some locations refused to leave livestock. Elderly residents refused to leave homes their families had occupied for generations. The Soviet government's approach to this resistance was not negotiation, it was enforcement. Livestock that could not be moved was destroyed on site. Personal property that exceeded what a single evacuee could carry onto a bus was abandoned. The economic loss embedded in those 188 communities is not fully calculable, but Soviet-era estimates placed the direct property and agricultural losses in the immediate evacuation zone at several billion rubles. The dosimetry picture inside the evacuation zone was not uniform, and this is the detail that turns the geography of escape into something more complicated than a simple radius calculation. The 30-kilometer circle drawn on maps is administratively convenient. It does not correspond to where the contamination actually went. Wind patterns in the days following the explosion carried radioactive material in irregular plumes. Some villages outside the 30-kilometer boundary received higher ground deposition levels than some villages inside it. The village of Narodichi, located 60 kilometers from the plant, received cesium-137 deposition levels that exceeded official safety thresholds. It was not included in the initial mandatory evacuation zone. Residents there continued living on contaminated land for years before the perimeter was eventually re-evaluated and expanded. Cesium-137 has a half-life of approximately 30.17 years. Strontium-90, another primary fission product released in the explosion, has a half-life of 28.8 years. These numbers matter because they define how long the escape from Chernobyl actually had to last. Leaving Pripyat on April 27, 1986 was the first exit. For the isotopes embedded in soil, in building materials, and in the food chain of the surrounding agricultural region, the contamination timeline extends into the 2060s at meaningful concentration levels. The physical escape was a single bus ride. The radiological escape is a multi-generational problem measured in decades. The liquidators represent the population that did not escape at all, not because they were trapped, but because they were assigned to go back in. Between 1986 and 1990, the Soviet government deployed an estimated 600,000 workers to the Chernobyl site for containment, cleanup, and construction of the concrete sarcophagus encasing reactor number 4. These were not volunteers in any meaningful sense of the word. Many were military reservists called up without full disclosure of the radiological conditions they would face. Average deployment periods ran between 2 weeks and 3 months, with individual dose tracking that critics and subsequent medical researchers argued was systematically underreported. Officially logged doses for most liquidators were kept below 35 Röntgen, the threshold above which a worker would be removed from the zone. Independent health studies conducted in subsequent decades suggest the actual absorbed doses for many workers significantly exceeded those official figures. The sarcophagus itself, formerly called the object shelter, was built in 206 days. It required 400,000 cubic meters of concrete and approximately 7,300 metric tons of metal structures. The workers who poured that concrete and welded those structures were operating in an environment where the standard definition of occupational radiation safety had been suspended by bureaucratic necessity. The structure they built was never designed as a permanent solution. It was designed to buy time. The gaps in its roof allowed rain and snow to enter the reactor space for decades. A second containment structure, the new Safe Confinement arch, was slid into position over the original sarcophagus in November 2016, 30 years after the explosion. That arch weighs 36,000 metric tons, spans 257 meters, and is designed for a service life of 100 years. Its construction cost approximately 1.5 billion euros, funded by an international consortium of 45 countries. The exclusion zone today covers approximately 2,600 square kilometers across Ukraine and a connected area within Belarus. The Ukrainian portion is managed by the State Agency of Ukraine on Exclusion Zone Management. Access requires a formal permit. Tourism within the zone generates several $1 million annually, with organized day trips from Kiev running between $100 and $300 per person. Approximately 180 self-settlers, mostly elderly women, returned to villages inside the zone in the years following the evacuation and have never left. Ukrainian authorities eventually stopped forcibly removing them. The population of Chernobyl town itself, which is distinct from Pripyat and sits approximately 15 kilometers from the reactor, currently houses the workers who rotate in and out to maintain the exclusion zone infrastructure. Pripyat has not been inhabited since April 27, 1986. The Ferris wheel in the city's amusement park, which was never actually opened before the evacuation, has become the most photographed symbol of the event. The bumper cars, the rides, the painted metal structures are still standing inside the zone, accumulating rust and vegetation at the pace that 38 years of abandonment produces. The red forest, a stand of pine trees that turned red and died from acute radiation exposure in the days following the explosion, remains one of the most contaminated surface areas in the world. Soil sampling in that area still returns cesium 137, and strontium 90 figures well above any threshold that would permit unrestricted human activity.